Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
Hello, this is Kevin Getz, your co-host for Ham and Jam. Welcome to another exciting episode. I am your chief advocate for everything that is Horsa, the greatest aircraft that was ever produced and that single-handedly won the Second World War. I can't do this without my good friend, Andy. Andy, how you doing?
I'm doing very well, but I've been slightly put off by our guest holding a mug of something up to the screen.
Yeah,
which is
it said Dakota on it, and yeah, she and I are going to have a rumble here pretty soon. I think this is the perfect time to introduce our guest. I am pleased and honored to know Norma Graham, our friend from Canada. Norma, how are you doing?
Pretty good. I'm here that I have set the cat among the pigeons. The Dakota plays a big role in what we're going to talk about today. We can both be proud of our airplane.
There you go. For the sake of our friendship, Norma, I will set aside the disparaging Dakota mug that you're flashing in front of my face. As in our virtual pub, we always are having a drink. Norma, what are you having tonight?
Well, I have had to pretty much quit drinking alcohol, sadly. I miss it. But my advanced age, I am very aware that I need to hang on to every brain cell. So I'm not drinking alcohol today. But if I were, it would be Okanagan cider from British Columbia.
Excellent. Andy, what are you having? Oh, wait a minute. Let me guess. Is it Guinness?
I kind of resent the fact that you think I'm some sort of Guinness-obsessed Brit. So I'm going to tell you something now that's going to shock you rigid. Yeah, I'm drinking a Guinness.
I was waiting for the world to stop turning for a second, and I'm disappointed.
I'm happy to oblige.
Wow. I don't know what I'm going to do with you. Oh, by the way, I'm going with the old speckled hen. So, as is our tradition, cheers.
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 We're going to take a trip to Europe, only we're going to go it via Canada with First Can Para. Norma, always like asking you this question because I'm always curious as to how people get started doing what prompted you to look into this and tell the story of First Can Para.
As you know, Kev, I am always putting forth the Canadian story in the Second World War. The contribution of Canadians to the war does tend to get glossed over or lumped in with the British or less often the Americans, but we don't get the same kind of, perhaps, that the other allied parties do. We've never made a Saving Private Ryan about Canada. So we just don't get the same kind of attention. So I'm always interested in telling the Canadian story. When I retired a couple of years ago, I made a pledge to devote whatever time and energy I have left to telling those stories that not only that the world never knew, but that Canadians have forgotten. That's what I'm doing. And the reason for First Can Para, there's actually a very good documentary that was done several years ago you can watch it on YouTube. It's called Victory from Above. And it tells the story of First Can Para from beginning to end. And it features several interviews with veterans of the battalion. And I always love anything that includes those interviews, that makes that connection with those men. To me, the way that you can connect with history is through those personal stories. I love those. And so when I watched that, I thought, more people need to know this story. These guys were just outstanding. And I want more of the world to hear about what they did.
Absolutely right.
Without a doubt, there's nothing out there to get people interested in what their fellow countrymen contributed to the Second World War. Admittedly, I'll be the first one to admit, I'm an airborne guy, but I didn't know a lot about First Can Para. And seeing that it was formed in 1942, what is the makeup of these guys? Who were these guys that were deciding this is the path, this is what they were going to do to fight?
They came from all over the country, right, from coast to coast. They were of European descent, they were indigenous, they were Asian, there were first and second generation immigrants, and also Canadians who'd been here for quite some time, several generations. So they were already enlisted. They'd already gone through basic training. Some of them were actually already in the UK. let's back up a little bit. In 1940, there was Colonel E.L.M. Burns, who later went on to lead the 1st Canadian Corps in Italy. In 1940, he was basically staff officer. And 4 times in the summer of 1940, he went to Canadian National Defence Headquarters with proposals to start a Canadian Airborne Battalion. And every time he was turned down. Part of the problem was that the Canadian government and the Canadian military, we were just coming out of the Depression. The Depression was very hard in Canada. There was no habit of spending money on military. The military had been very underfunded during the interwar period. So there was no political will to create such a specialized battalion. But by 1942, things were starting to turn around. There was Canadian officers who had been sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, where the American airborne battalions were training, and also to Ringway. They'd been to Ringway, and so they could see what was happening. So at that point, they went ahead and created the 1st Canpera. At first, the idea was, and this was to make it palatable for the politicians, to say that the parachute battalion would be for home defense. It wasn't that long after Pearl Harbor, and there was concern of invasion on our west coast. So they said it was for home defense, even though they knew that the military knew that wasn't probably going to wash or going to happen. But these young fellas, they were already through their basic training, and the call went out, if you are the best of the best, or you think you are, come and join the parachute battalion. And at first there was reluctance because, well, as I said, they were supposed to be for home defense only. And these were all guys who were rare to get overseas. But that changed. They changed that so that they were going to be serving overseas. So some of these guys, they wanted to be with the best. Some of them really felt the urgency of the world situation and wanted to be effective in changing that. And there were some who they saw their friends that had joined up with their uniforms on and thought, well, that looks pretty spiffy. Maybe I'll join them. So there was a variety of reasons, but only about 1 in 3 of applicants who tried to get into the training were allowed in. And even after then they washed out pretty fast if they weren't sufficiently aggressive and self-confident.
This is all voluntary. There's no conscription, correct?
Not at this stage. Yeah.
Okay.
Small amount of conscription right at the very end of the war when there was desperation because casualty levels in places like the Scheldt meant that we were having trouble replenishing the supply of soldiers. But at this point, no, it was purely voluntary. And out of a population at that time of 11.5 million, over 1 million men and women were in uniform.
So that really speaks to the fact that Canada is punching well above its weight.
Yes.
So they end up absorbed into 3rd Brigade. Well, what are their thoughts about when that happens? Do they sense, hey, we're going to get into a fight now? Or is it just, oh, here we go. The Brits are going to be in charge of us again. Is there any of that going on?
There may have been. The first recruits that were in Canada trained at Fort Benning. So because the training grounds in Canada at Fort Shiloh in Manitoba had not been completed. But the ones who were recruited of men who were already in the UK trained at Ringway. So they were used to being around Brits. Canada did not have, once they got these guys together and they got them trained, and they were splendid. They were marvelous. But Canada did not have the infrastructure in our military to be able to support an airborne or a parachute battalion. It takes an enormous infrastructure to support that, and it just didn't exist. So the 1st Canpera was offered to and gratefully accepted by 6th Airborne. And at this point, they got extremely lucky because they were put into 3rd Brigade with their Brigadier James Hill. And there could not have been a better commander for this battalion than James Hill.
He loved his Canadians.
He did, and they loved him back. He was like a father figure to them. If your father was somebody who made you jump out of airplanes, he cared for them. He looked after them. he felt very strongly the responsibility for looking after these guys because he realized they were orphaned. Other than their uniforms and their pay, they had no contact with other Canadians. So understanding that about them, he really took them under his wing. He went to all their training exercises. He even jumped with them sometimes. He was tough. He was a real hard taskmaster when it came to training and physical fitness, but he loved them and they adored him right back. Andy Anderson, who was one of the sergeants in one of the companies of 1st Can Para, said, in the line of attack, you could always find the brigadier at your elbow. He was always at the front. He was totally without fear. He's what I always imagined as a great leader. So that was the best luck that those guys had, was to get James Hill as their brigadier. And after the war, he used to come to Canada to go to veterans events, kept in touch with them all. That relationship didn't end until they were all gone.
His nickname was Speedy Hill because on route marches, he was always at the front and you had to keep up with him, and he was fast.
Yeah, he was splendid. What an amazing man he was. I wish he was still around because I'd love to tell him so.
Something in your notes that I found really interesting, which was Brigadier Hill's comment about when right before Varsity is ready to happen, he reads those Canadian lads and said something to the fact that they're spoiling for a fight. What gives him the reason to think that? Is this the inactivity since D-Day?
They didn't have inactivity since D-Day because they'd been in the Ardennes, right? So they'd been busy enough. No, he read his men like a book. And that went for all of the brigades under his command, or all of the battalions in his brigade. Mm-hmm. So he said that the 8th Battalion was like shock and awe. And then his 9th Battalion was like the surgical strike. They were the artists. They could do very complicated maneuvers because they loved all that kind of intricacy. And the Canadians were the Cowboys, the guys who could stomp a mud hole and walk it dry. So he had to warn them before Varsity to stay in their lane, basically, to not be carrying off and helping other battalions do their job, that they had to focus on what their job was, which they cheerfully ignored, of course, and ended up doing whatever they wanted, because that was the thing, the parachute battalion training that made them such amazing soldiers, so effective, was that they were trained to function as a unit, function as a company, a platoon, as in pairs, singly. Even if their commanding officer was lost, they knew exactly what they were supposed to be doing, and they were empowered to do it. And that would work well with Canadians. It's a good thing they had James Hill as their brigadier, because he led from the front. And with Canadians, you don't automatically get respect. You have to earn it. Hill definitely earned their respect. That kind of what I was saying about being able to work sort of independently in whatever situation they find themselves in, that would suit Canadians really well, because we have a very unstratified society and we don't really like people telling us what to do. We're very independent thinkers, right? So that would have worked really well.
We talked about this with Neil Barber because we had talked about the 9th Parachute Battalion and how the success of battalion hinges upon its leadership. Tell us about the CO.
Yeah, Jeff Nicklin was very interesting man. He was originally, I think, from Toronto area, but he was living out in Manitoba because he was a star player for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And they won the Grey Cup in 1935 and 1939, and Nicklin was part of that team. So he was top physical form and expected everybody else to be the same. And there was a fair amount of resentment because he drove them hard. Now, he drove them hard because he didn't want them to die. And the more physically fit you were, the better your chances of survival in the situations that they found themselves in. So he was their 3rd commanding officer. The first commanding officer who they started out with was killed at Fort Benning in an accident. Their second commanding officer, Bradbrook, is who led them in Normandy. And after Normandy, I think his nerves were shot for good reason.
Right.
So he was replaced at that point by Jeff Nicklin. Nicklin was killed at the Varsity jump. He never got to the ground. His chute came down and got tangled in a tree right above a German machine gun nest. And he was found about 36 hours later after Varsity. So that was quite a tragedy for the men. And he was succeeded by Lieutenant Colonel Fraser Eady. And Eady saw them to the end of the war. And fortunately, Eady lived a good long life. So we have a lot of his memories and his thoughts about his experiences in recordings, which was great. After the war, just after the war, the veterans of the battalion instituted the Jeff Nicklin Memorial Trophy, which is, they donated the trophy, and it's been awarded to the best player among the Western Conference teams of Football League ever since.
What does the death of Nicklin do? And I'm comparing it in the sense of like when Malmedy, when the massacre there happened, and suddenly the word starts spreading around to the guys on the ground. Hey, this is what happened. What reaction does that have with the battalion?
My impression from what I've read is that at this point, I were used to loss. Nicklin had been injured when they were in Normandy about 5 weeks into the Normandy campaign, and he had to be evacuated, and Fraser Eady took over at that time. So they were accustomed to being led by Fraser Eady. Nicklin was not a chummy guy to his men. He was not a buddy. So they didn't feel like they'd lost a friend. So I would say that they just picked up and kept going because they had a job to do. So they did.
You mentioned they had a job to do. What exactly was their part of Varsity? What were they tasked to do?
Well, Varsity was a daytime drop, which was a nice change for them from Normandy. So they were able to come down as Brigadier Hill had requested in a very concentrated area. This concentrated area was exactly where the Germans would expect them to come. So they knew that the drop zone was going to be hot. The preliminary bombardment that was supposed to put some of the guns out of action didn't do a very good job, but they soldiered on. The one thing that was in their favor was that the German commander had assumed that by 9 o'clock, when there was no drop, that there wasn't going to be one, at least not that day. So he sent a bunch of his men to the river to try and deal with some of the land forces that were coming across the Rhine. So it was Major General Eric Bowles, who was by this time the overall commander of 6th Airborne, said, "Well, gentlemen, you'll be glad to know that this time we're not going to be dropped down as the carrot held out for the ground forces. Army and Navy are going to storm across the Rhine, and just when they've gained Jerry's attention in front, bingo, we drop down behind them." So that was the plan. And it was a beautiful day, which is good. Nice and clear for them. There was a bit misty over the drop zone, but it was a beautiful day. At one point in the Dakota that Fraser Eady was in, one of his men said to him, "Man, it's a beautiful morning. I wish I could have gone fishing instead." Their job was to hit the one end of Deer's Porter Wood, which was, they called it axe handle wood. The men of 3rd Brigade were to drop it at 10 o'clock, and their drop zone was in a clearing at the north end of Deer's Porter Wood, which was about 6 miles northwest of Basel. And it sprawls across the country northwest of Basel. And there's sort of 2 prongs of the wood at the north end, one of which looked like an axe handle, and they called it axe handle wood. 8th Battalion was to clear the enemy out of there and off the drop zone. 9th Battalion was to secure Schneppenberg Ridge, which was the high ground that was being held by Fallschirmjäger. So they had a hard job. And 1st Canpera was sent to clear the southwest corner, which was the most densely populated area. And there were a lot of fortified farmhouses and barns in that region where the enemy was entrenched. They were also to take and hold the village of Burverfirth and some of the road junctions in the area. So the interviews that were done with the veterans, they were at pains to talk about how the American pilots of the Dakotas that were dropping them took such care to drop them exactly where they were supposed to, even though they were being shot at with anti-aircraft fire. And several of them, of course, crashed and burned. Bob Furlot said that the plane that he was in was just before they jumped, it was hit by anti-aircraft fire, and the engine on the door side started to burn. And he said, I didn't really jump. I got thrown out of the plane. They were a little higher than they were supposed to be, but they were exactly in the right spot, or as close to exact as you're ever going to get. There was a lot of those guys that were flying those planes that died doing the job, but they were determined. Dan Hardigan remembers an NCO on his plane saying, as soon as you hit the bloody deck, fix bayonets and go for the goddamn woods.
Have you been able to decipher any thoughts about how First Can prepared for this? Because this is something completely different than jumping into Normandy, France, and you're helping liberate. You're now going into home turf of the Germans. So there's going to be some differences here. Any thoughts on how they prepared or how they handled that differently?
Fraser Eady said, once we dropped in on Operation Varsity, the battalion had become purely a professional unit. In my opinion, there was none better. So their training by this point and their level of fitness was beyond what you can imagine. Also, they'd seen enough by this point that they were fiercely determined. If attitude counts, they had an attitude. They'd been in Belgium at Band, B-A-N-D-E, and had been the ones that had discovered the civilians that had been massacred and put away in the basement, little boys and old men. And that, if they had been tempted to be soft-hearted before, that certainly put an end to that. So fiercely determined would be probably an understatement. I think that's what James Hill saw in their eyes the night before Varsity.
Some of my favorite photographs of 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, the guys are obviously getting ready to go, and some of them are sporting mohawks, and you read some of the accounts and they're carrying tomahawks.
There were Indigenous members, like there were Canadian First Nations. So like in the battalion, some of the white guys were amazed at how well some of their Indigenous could sort of meld into the woods and not be seen. That how good they were at tracking and sneaking up and just being really incredibly capable in that sort of bushcraft. Anyway, so as far as you had asked about what their jobs were. So C Company jumped first because that was tradition with them. They always sent C Company first. And they immediately assaulted the road junction and the farms. And within 35 minutes, they'd taken their objectives and held them. There were, of course, counterattacks because there were always counterattacks. But by 4:30 in the afternoon, they could hear the tanks coming from the river. So they knew that their relief was on its way. So they had no trouble holding. Now, they did lose their senior leadership. One was taken prisoner and one was injured in the drop, broke his collarbone. But 2 sergeants organized the men to secure the objectives. So again, this is where their training is so spectacular that they can lose their commanding officers and still know what to do and still do it well. B Company's drop zone was very hot, but was brought under control quickly. And they overran the buildings that were their objectives and drove the enemy out. Captain Sam Gallant showed up late to the rendezvous point. He was bleeding heavily from a head wound. And Fraser Eady saw him, and he saw that there was a hole in the front of his helmet and a hole at the back of his helmet. And he said to McGowan, "Are you all right?" And McGowan said, "I got a bit of a headache." That the bullet had gone in the front, traveled around the rim of the helmet, and gone out the back. So he really was okay.
Yeah.
And then A Company landed accurately at the eastern end of their drop zone and mounted an immediate attack on the buildings that were to be used as the battalion's HQ. And enemy resistance was quashed when Company Sergeant Major George Green led a Piat detachment and cleared the houses, and he received a DCM for his courage. By early afternoon, their objectives were all taken. And then at 4:30, the British 15th Division arrived and helped with the mopping up. And the total casualties for the battalion were 28 killed, 35 wounded, and 4 missing. One of the missing was taken prisoner by the Germans, and then by April 18th, so 3-4 weeks later, he was back again because he escaped and caught up with the rest of the guys. So
it's interesting you mentioned the DCM there, because obviously Varsity is also the operation where 6th Airborne get their first and one and only Victoria Cross, and that goes to a Canadian.
Yes, it does. And we are so proud of that.
And rightly so.
So that wonderful young man who was at the time 27 years old, who received the VC, he had originally joined 48th Highlanders, which was a Toronto regiment. He was from Toronto. He was a big fella, big, tall, well-built young man, and had been in Northern Ontario doing mining work for a few years before the war. So he was exceptionally fit. And when the battalion's medical officer saw him, he said, I'll be having some of that, because he needed big, strong, strapping guys to carry stretchers and carry wounded and so on and so forth. So this was George Frederick Topham. They called him Toppy. And he became a medic, but he also had the same infantry training as the rest of the guys in the battalion. So he jumped with C Company, so that was first out, began clearing casualties off the drop zone right away. But then he saw 2 men from 224 Parachute Field Ambulance Battalion get shot and killed on their way to pick up a wounded man in the drop zone. So he sprang into action and ran to the casualty, and bullets were flying around him. One of them laid open his cheek and the other went through his nose. Now, can you imagine how much that hurt? Ever been punched in the nose?
Unfortunately, yes.
It's blindingly painful. I've never been punched in the nose, but I've hit it a few times. But he refused to stop. He refused to be evacuated. He just kept going. For 2 hours, he cleared that drop zone of wounded men, patched them up, took them off, got them sent out to safety, went back in and did it for 2 hours. And Fraser Eady remembers Toppy refused to be evacuated. He went back out there again and continued evacuating in the drop zone until he had cleared it. It wasn't until then that he finally agreed to sit down, listen to reason, and let the doctors work on them. And even then, he refused to be evacuated. So that in itself probably would have won him something, but there was more to come. So they took him to the aid station, got him treated. He insisted on going back to help. On the way back, he saw a burning Bren gun carrier that had received a direct hit, and it was packed with mortar ammunition. And of course, it's fizzing and popping and hot and ready to go, ready to blow. And there were 3 guys still in that Bren carrier, and with enemy mortar bombs still falling all around them. And despite being ordered by an officer not to approach the carrier, Toppy climbed up on it and lifted each of those men out. Seconds after he leapt off the carrier, it exploded. Now, one of the men did die of his injuries, sadly, but 2 of them survived. And I'm sure that they owe their lives to Toppy Topham. And then he went back to his company and went back to work. And after the war, he was asked, of course, everybody made a big fuss about it when he got home. Newspapers were badgering him. And he said, I just want to lie low until this blows over. Well, he said, I simply did what any man in my outfit would have done. Now, I don't know about that, but it was in June that he received word. So they were on their way home by this point that he was going to receive the VC. And Toppy spent the rest of his life in Toronto area, and worked for Ontario Hydro, putting up poles. Yeah. If anybody ever deserved a VC, it was Toppy.
Yeah. Is he still as known today as he was 80 years ago?
I don't think so. Those of us who are students of Canadian military history, of course, know who he is. But the general public, no. We didn't have a Saving Private Ryan to get people, or a Band of Brothers. I mean, these guys could have done Band of Brothers, but we just don't have that.
Unfortunately, the Canadians are even pretty much written out of The Longest Day. In fact, I don't think you see the Canadians once in that.
And we're also written out of A Bridge Too Far, because it was Canadian engineers who ran the storm boats that got the airborne guys out of Arnhem.
The British engineers did go across for Op Berlin, but it was Canadians that had the actual storm boats with motors on them. So they were the ones that actually did the heavy lifting.
Is it?
Yep.
So what's Canada's feeling once these guys get back with regards to what 1st Cam Para was able to achieve with their war experience?
Quiet pride. That's how we do it. They were brought back before just about any other Canadian soldiers or airmen or whatever, because there was a PR aspect to bringing home these heroes. After their work was not done when Varsity was over. They had a few very exciting weeks ahead of them.
They did. Yeah. They had a very important job to do up around Denmark.
At Wismar, yeah. So they had some exciting times ahead of them yet. They were the first Canadians or British to meet the Red Army at Wismar and stop them in their tracks. They didn't know whether it was going to be World War III or just a meeting of allies, but it was Winston Churchill who sent them.
That's right, yeah.
And 6th Airborne said, let's send the Canadians. But here's the advantage, again, of having this multicultural society, a multicultural battalion, was that there were guys in the battalion who spoke Russian and could act as interpreters. So there was good sense there in setting the Canadians up to stop the Red Army.
Yeah.
I want to quote from Brigadier James Hill what he said about his Canadians. He said, "What splendid ambassadors for their great country they have proved to be whilst isolated and serving with the 6th Airborne throughout their war in Europe. They were called upon and paid the full price for freedom and service for their country. 120 men never returned to Canada. 294 had been carried off the field of battle wounded. 84 had suffered in German prison camps. A casualty list of over 500 from that one and only battalion. I thanked the Almighty for the privilege of being their brigade commander."
And that's a very fitting way of encapsulating the Canadians in World War II, I think, not just the Paras, but the Canadians in general.
Absolutely, for sure. Just the contributions, and not only from an airborne standpoint, but from logistics, from a naval standpoint.
Yeah.
Just incredible. Norma, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to come onto our podcast and to talk about what the Canadians had done, especially during Varsity, but in general, overall, with their contributions to the 6th Airborne Division. Andy and I had talked about, too, there's so many times that, especially when it comes to 6th Airborne Division, most people, the first thing they think about is Pegasus Bridge and Maryville Battery. And a lot of times the other battalions get overlooked, and then especially the Canadians get overlooked. So thank you for taking the time to give us the story.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And I'm always up for talking about my Canadian boys.
Well, it's funny you say that, Norma, because I'm sure after this episode, our listeners will be wanting you to come back on and talk about the Canadians in Normandy.
That's definitely going to happen. You're not going to get off lightly with just one episode, Norma.
There's some tales to tell about the chateau at Varaville, and Dan Harkin features quite prominently in those tales as well. So our listeners will be looking forward to that one, I should think.
Dan Hardigan's book, it goes very granular on Normandy. Like that's all it is just Normandy. He really does a deep dive into their role there. The story of Brigadier Hill getting badly wounded and then refusing to be evacuated to England, insisting that he be patched up and sent back to be with his men. The guy was just such an amazing human being.
He really was, yeah. So, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap things up because the old landlord is giving us the look, which means that we're going to be coming to an end of this episode. So, again, thanks, Norma, for coming on. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. So, we're going to call time, ladies and gentlemen, on this episode of Ham and Jam. And you will hear us on the next one. But without further ado, raise a glass, everybody, if you got one. Cheers. And
Ham and Jam.
Ham and Jam.
Ham and Jam.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support us on buymeacoffee.com.
Is it liquid brown stuff again?